Please welcome Lauren Gustus, Nancy Barnes, Kathleen Hennessey, and Knight Foundation trustee Dean Baquet.
Thank you. Thanks for sticking around. So for obvious reasons, much of the discussion about the future of local journalism has focused on the new entrants, many of them nonprofits, smaller newsrooms. When we talk about the traditional regional news organizations, when we do, we mainly talk about cuts, whether it's at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution or the Washington Post. But some of the regionals are actually doing better than others. The San Francisco Chronicle, Seattle, Philadelphia. So the core of this panel is, why are some making it while others are not? And what lessons are there? So each of these editors represents newsrooms in different parts of the country. Two have wealthy backers, one is a nonprofit. So let's start with Kathleen Hennessey, who's the editor of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. But before we start, we should give a round of applause to her and all of the journalists in Minneapolis.
That's for the newsroom, for sure. I will take all that back.
And for you.
Yeah.
So first off, roughly, how big is your newsroom? What could you do on this story that a smaller newsroom couldn't? And how do you distinguish yourself from all of the terrific other news organizations that are covering the story?
Yeah. The one thing that was really clear that I think sort of maybe the rest of the country discovered in the last month or so was this amazing ecosystem of media in Minnesota and based in the Twin Cities. We have a lot of nonprofit newsrooms and good, healthy competition and strong newsrooms at TV stations. And everybody rose to the occasion. There was plenty of news on this story on immigration and deportation and protest. But we have the largest newsroom in the state, which is at 205. Not that I'm counting.
You said 205?
205 is what we're at.
That's huge these days.
It's huge. It's enormous. But we do feel that that is our role, right? Is to be sort of to embrace any big news story and know the responsibility that we can cover it, and we have to cover it completely, totally, aggressively first. We have to own it. I think that's how we distinguish ourselves. We decided from the beginning that every resource in the newsroom that needed to be thrown on the story would be, and we did, pretty much, and set out to lead in that way, I think. And as I'm sure other editors here know, we've all been in meetings where someone will say, well, I'd like to do that story, but so-and-so's on PTO and someone's on vacation. And the one thing about having 200 people in your newsroom is that's never an excuse, right? We can always if we want something, we can always go do it. And that is probably how we're different than everybody else in the market.
Are there, so beyond size, are there specific, I guess it is part of size, specific things that you can think of that you were able to do that others can't?
Well, we have an investigative team. Small but mighty, but that mattered. We had a really strong video journalist and some design resources that we could immediately throw into. This was a very visual story, a very video-heavy story, so we did video forensics. We had beat reporters that could break news on all kinds of, on each part of this story. So having all of the pieces, we have an exceptional team of photojournalists, and again, this was such a visual story that those are the things that we could do that I think made us stand out.
So Nancy's run the Boston Globe, Star-Tribune, and the Houston Chronicle. So I would say those three newsrooms are doing differently. I think of Houston as struggling maybe a little more than the Globe. Why, if you run through those three, why are some doing better than others? What's different?
One of the things that I think is different is that the newspapers that are thriving, you've named some of them, Star-Tribune, Boston Globe are in communities where civic engagement is high. People actually really care about the local news ecosystem. When I was in Minnesota, it was one of the highest voting percentages in the country. That often translates into support for newspapers. When I got to Houston, it was among the lowest in the country. I was just shocked at the voting rate. Also, translates into lower consumption generally. That's not, 100%. And we had, by the time we were done in Minnesota, when I left, it was strong local ownership. It wasn't there when I started. And in Boston, it's also strong local ownership. You don't have to answer to private equity, and you don't have to answer to Wall Street.
That cultural portrait of how some cities are more engaged. I mean, I worked in Chicago where everybody voted, and I worked in Los Angeles where people barely knew who the. What is that? Just a historic? When you think of Boston, Houston, Minneapolis, is that just a historic fact that you? And I'm going to come back to what you can do to combat history. But is it?
Yeah. Is it? I think in Minnesota it is historic. And in Boston too. Houston is a place that has just changed tremendously over the years. I haven't been there since 2018. But what you remember like Space City, and then hundreds of thousands of people moved there from all over the world, and it became a very different type of community. I still remember to this day getting a haircut from a man from Vietnam, and he goes, "What's the Houston Chronicle?" I was like, that happens in Boston some now too, but not as much as you would think. So I do think it's part of it. It is the nature of the community and the nature of consumption habits. And Massachusetts, I've got to say, and I started my career here. I was born in Massachusetts. I was still astonished by the strength and belief in news and the news ecosystem. The mayor would tell me, that news at the Globe moves what happens in City Hall on a daily basis. People pay attention, and some of that, I think Marty is in the room. I still hear about the Catholic Church scandal and how important that was to the community. So they care and they understand that news and the Globe and our two big public radio stations can make a difference in their lives.
I'm going to come back after I ask Lauren a question because I want to hear whether I would hate for people who work in cities that don't have that kind of engagement to throw their hands up and move. So I want to come back. I want to come back to whether you can, but don't answer yet, whether you can create that. So Lauren, Salt Lake Tribune's about to remove its paywall. In your annual report, you said you needed one to survive in the beginning, but you don't need one now. What happened? How'd you get there? How big is your newsroom? And did it make a difference in terms of engagement or the way you deal with the community and the way you covered the community when you don't know yet, but do you anticipate it would make a difference?
Yeah, thanks. So the Salt Lake Tribune is 155 years old. So we've been around for a while, but we're only 6 years into this journey as a nonprofit. We were owned by a hedge fund, and then we were owned by a billionaire. And it turns out that neither of those solutions were optimal.
You did the whole thing. You should.
There we go. And
I am going to ask you which was better, but finish the.
Really? Oh, no.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wasn't there. No, I'm kidding. But now, we're stewarded by the community. And we see our responsibility as being to the 3.5 million people who live in Utah. And when we became a nonprofit, we did focus a lot on how the journalism had to change. So we looked a lot like a major metro. We covered crime, we covered traffic, and that's not to say that we don't cover those at more of a meta level, but we're focused on solutions journalism. We're focused on listening before we begin reporting. So with support from Knight and JJP, we just launched a newsroom in Southern Utah called the Southern Utah Tribune. It reaches 40,000 people in print for free a month and then online and so on and so forth. Before we launched that, we listened to 600 people. They told us what they wanted and that informed the product, right? And I think we have the time, but also the responsibility to listen on the front end before we begin our reporting. And that's what's really, I think, deepened the connection that people have to the Salt Lake Tribune today. And as we prepare to remove that paywall, we feel like the journalism has to change again because we have to move from a transactional experience with people, they've got to subscribe to read a story, to, gosh, they have to like what they're seeing enough to voluntarily support us.
So that leads back to the question I want to ask everybody. You started it. So can you create that sense of cohesion? You can't. I get that you can't make Los Angeles Boston, and you can't make Houston Minneapolis. But how do you think about creating the sense of community that a regional newsroom needs to survive? Maybe start with Lauren.
Okay.
And then I'm going to ask you maybe off camera, who's better, the hedge fund or the...
So I do believe that listening is at the root of what we're doing, but I think that has to be, how do I want to say this? It has to exist in many different spaces and places. So just practically, right? In an effort to build trust, we do source audits quarterly. We look at how many affected people are featured in our stories versus public officials. That's a way to build trust, right? We work with high school journalists in part so that we can understand what they want from their media, self-serving, right? But also because we feel like we're making an investment in the next generation of journalists. We co-publish reporting together. We're working with something called the Utah News Collaborative that we built. It's 20 news organizations across the state. They take our reporting for free. We take theirs. We're going to start selling ads together as a collaborative, right? How can we lift up the ecosystem and we hope strengthen that civic news infrastructure that exists in Utah in the process?
I'm curious what you found when you did your first source audit.
Oh, we're awful.
In what way?
Okay. Utah is predominantly LDS, right? And it is not all that diverse, especially compared to some of the communities that exist in Minnesota or even in Massachusetts and certainly, in Texas and elsewhere. And our source audit reflected that. I think it was 70% white males who we quoted, right? That's a problem, right? If we're trying to reflect the community better.
So each of you, the question of can you create a sense of cohesion? What do you do if you're in Houston and not in Boston? Nancy.
So I have a couple of thoughts. One is when there's a big event in your community and you swarm it and it affects everybody, you can build a sense of community around that. So I think about when I was in Houston during Hurricane Harvey, which was just a terrible disaster. And disasters unite newsrooms when you have to cover one. And they unite a community too, especially if you are serving that community and delivering them the information that they need. It brings people together in really interesting ways. We had community events in the Houston Chronicle building. We were out in the community for months and months and months. I think that helped. Some of it is strategy and tactics. Newsletters that serve especially if you're in a diverse, spread out community, newsletters that serve, like in Houston would be, how do you navigate your schools? In Boston, we just did a pop-up newsletter around immigration and deportation, because that's a huge storyline there. It was amazing the people who reached out and signed up and became part of the Globe community because of those newsletters. And then you talk about listening to community, getting out there and listening in places where you're not traditionally known to be. We had dozens of events last year all across the community on everything from our coverage to listening to what's going on in their communities, to their needs. We did coverage on the 50th anniversary of busing. Everybody remembers that story in Boston, and we were in those neighborhoods that were affected. And that also helped build some community there. And we used to be absent from those communities.
Kathleen?
Mm-hmm. I'd say a few things. First, as obviously in Minnesota, there is a big, strong civic culture, but I would say that that's not really enough to build a business model that sustains a newsroom of our size. And so we have to look beyond that. And even what it means to be civically engaged is sort of changing. And we can't just sell subscriptions to people whose parents had subscriptions. So we're definitely trying to think more broadly about what we mean by community and focusing on our strengths and people's passions. Like, what do they love and what do they want to build habits around? What do they already have habits around, and how can we get in those spaces? So we've gone really, really big on prep sports because people love high school sports and already spend a ton of time on it. And we had great coverage, and So we've gone all in. Food coverage is huge for us. Our restaurant coverage is fantastic. That's a community that we're breaking into. The business community in the Twin Cities is very connected, very passionate, and no one was totally owning them. We're stepping into those spaces. And we're doing journalism, but we're also convening events and newsletters and live streams and sort of really trying to open up the doors of the newsroom a little and make our journalists known people that people trust and understand and can recognize on the street and feel like they understand what we do. So there's a lot of pieces all at once, but I'd say generally we're just trying to sort of be relevant to as many people as we can.
So how much of a difference does business model make? Maybe start with Lauren. Tell us like deep stories and, gossipy, no. How much of a difference does business model make?
Well, we're an open book. You cited our impact report. I mean, we share all of our
But you
data.
you've had other kinds of ownership models.
Yes, absolutely. I do think, it's helpful to be able to make decisions around what is best for those who you have a responsibility to versus what the expected return on an investment may be. Maybe that's stating the obvious, but we don't have any shareholders. We don't have a mandate to return a profit. We reinvest. We've got a revenue pie that is about a third right now. So it's a third advertising, it's a third subscriptions, it's a third philanthropic support. That includes major, small dollars, you name it. When we remove the paywall, those subscribers will mostly transition to members, although we do have print revenue and we will retain that print revenue. But even in the nonprofit space, right, or even in, I should say, philanthropic space, we've tried to take care such that we're not reliant on any one funder. With all the gratitude in the world for those who do support us, if anyone left, we wouldn't be in trouble tomorrow, right? We wouldn't cease to publish, if you will. So I do think that governance and the nonprofit structure has supported the Tribune in ways that have been transformational.
Nancy?
I want to start in Minnesota because for most of my career, I've been blessed to work in privately held companies where you could navigate your own future. I went to Minnesota as part of McClatchy. I had been there several years before I got a call from the head of news from McClatchy that says, Nancy, get ready. We just bought Knight Ridder. It's going to be great. And get ready to write your story. So you all know that story didn't end that well. They quickly sold us to private equity. And we were like, you abandoned us. It turned out to be a gift. Rarely will I say this about private equity. It turned out to be a gift because the debt that they incurred and the business model at that time, with classifieds was going like this. It was clear that it was never going to work. They bought a falling knife. They took us into bankruptcy. They walked away. We were able to emerge, and it was tough. I had to take a newsroom from 400 to 270 in the course of a year and a half, and then it was stable. So, and we had a private board, and then it was sold to the owner of the Timberwolves, and it was stable. The business model that we were able to put in place was stable for more than a decade. And I sat there and watched all of my friends in McClatchy, where year after year, they had debt covenants that they had to serve for having bought Knight Ridder. They had to cut year after year to meet their debt covenants until they did finally go into bankruptcy. And by then, the paper that I came from at the News and Observer is a shadow of the paper it used to be. Houston, privately owned by Hearst. They were tough owners. They definitely believed in a profit. All my Hearst colleagues out here know that was tough, but I still had enough resources to do what I need to do, and I could negotiate internally. And then Boston's owned by the Henrys, and it's been stable. It wasn't when they bought it. They had some tough years, but it's been stable for a while. We are in the black, and this year we beat our projections for growing subscriptions. So I think that local ownership, having control of your own destiny is just incredibly important and has been a gift to me.
So is that less business model, or is that more just stability?
I think it's, well, you know, if you're owned by, it's ownership model for one.
Right.
And the business model depends on, I think everybody's trying to have a mix of subscriptions and advertising and events. And so I think that doesn't change that much. But I do think the ownership model and how they operate the business, whether it's for profit, whether it's to serve, which, you know, whether it's to serve Wall Street, not so much anymore, or your private equity, sometimes overlords, I'm going to use that word, is incredibly important.
I thought when I was in LA, the thing that made it hardest of all was the chaos. The not knowing what your budget was going to be from year to year to year. And it was just not knowing where you could invest, which I'll come back to. Kathleen, business model?
Yeah, well, I would just add to that. I mean, I do think that being able to be focused, this is sort of being in control of your own destiny, to decide what your strategy is and to execute it, and to not feel like year to year you're chasing new stuff, or every shiny object, right, that comes, you have to sort of jump in and follow that. So we're owned by Glenn Taylor, who is a Minnesotan, wealthy, generous man who believes in journalism and independent journalism. And I have no illusions about sort of how important that is to why we're able to do what we do. And I think this last story in the last 6 weeks or so really sort of demonstrated that, you know, we were able to meet the moment because we had a newsroom that had not been gutted, that was not that much smaller than when Nancy left it a decade ago or so. And we really had, you know, Glenn largely protected the paper through that very rough time. And I think now and in the last few years is invested in, and so we've been able to take a few risks to try to accelerate the digital transformation and some of the change that we've needed. And that, being able to have that flexibility, I mean, it's rare. It's very rare, and it is actually allowed us to make some changes. One of the things we did, we rebranded. We were the Minneapolis Star Tribune. We became the Minnesota Star Tribune. We put a bunch of reporters out in rural.
Would you dwell a little bit on that
Yeah.
change? You became became more of a statewide news organization.
A statewide news organization. We have now about 10 different reporters based in what we describe as greater Minnesota, a handful of different cities. These are, you know, one reporter bureaus. But that wasn't exactly a revenue play. I mean, no one figured that out and said, okay, this is how we're going to explode subscriptions. But it was about building community. It was about improving coverage, covering the whole state. It was about adding journalism to places that had lost journalists, and to sort of experiment with something new. And I think it's done all of those things and still has potential to grow subscriptions, and is. But we can only do that if we have a little bit of investment from someone who's taking a bet.
Would you walk through that decision, the discussion, like with? I assume were you there?
I was not there.
Okay.
I can.
But walk through what you know about it. Was it a pitch? You know, do you go to the publisher and you say, did you move 10 people from the city? Did you?
So it was really initiated by the publisher. 3 years ago, the Star Tribune, Mike Klingensmith, who had been the publisher, retired, and Steve Grove came on. It was the first new publisher in a long time, and it was part of, I believe, his sort of pitch to our owner, you know, as part of sort of, this is how we're going to revitalize and accelerate the digital transformation. And so the rebrand was part of that. It also involved a total revamp of the website and a reorganization of the newsroom, and just sort of a massive sort of jolt of change that involved, I think wisely, looking out at the state and seeing, you know, that our state has lost, I think it's 75% of journalists in the last 20 years. I mean, just huge numbers, huge communities that are not covered. And what if we just took 10 people and put them out in Bemidji and St. Cloud and Mankato and gave them newsletters and had them cover their community, but also write about the community for the larger state? And it's working, you know. I mean, it's
when you say it's working, is it working journalistically? Is there evidence it's working in terms of audience?
I think it's improving our coverage without a doubt, right? I mean, we are just able to jump on stories and to better reflect the whole state, right? And they're just like every place in America, you know, there are huge differences between the Twin Cities and Bemidji. I mean, and so, I don't know if anyone's ever been to Bemidji. I'm not picking, I love Bemidji. But these are not the same, right? And if you cannot, like, if you really want to represent the whole state, you have to understand both of those places. If you're going to write about public policy in the state, you have to understand both of those places. So I think our coverage is better. We are building community around these newsletters in some of these places. I would say it's not hockey stick growth suddenly on subscriptions, you know, and we know that, but it's a slow, steady grind that I think is worth it.
I'm going to come back to change, driving change. I'll start with Lauren, but ask everybody, none of these newsrooms are as big as they used to be, right? I mean, no, very few newsrooms are. What don't you cover, start with Lauren, but for everybody, that you wish you covered? What's been cut over the years? What sacrifices have you had to make in order to do some of the things you're talking about? Lauren, what's not covered?
Yeah. Our business desk is not nearly as strong as it was. I would say the same for our health coverage and our healthcare coverage. And yet I would submit that we've reallocated those resources into areas where more people are spending their time. So, you know, we have dedicated video resources, right? We have dedicated resources for Instagram and newsletters and so on and so forth. So where we've pulled back topically from a platform perspective, we've tried to invest such that we can meet people where they are.
Nancy?
So I'd say we cover Boston, greater Massachusetts, and New England. But what haunts me actually is really when you get outside of greater Boston, and sometimes not even outside of greater Boston. There are newspapers there. I never saw them break a story most of the 3 years I've been there now. Communities where there used to be huge, really thriving newspapers, Quincy Patriot Ledger right in my backyard. There's no coverage. We can barely cover it. We can barely cover Everett. We can't cover Lowell and Lawrence and Worcester. And what do I know, because I've been around for a long time, is that when you have nobody covering your city hall and nobody covering your school districts, things go wrong and corruption springs up. And it haunts me that those parts of the state and really in lots of places elsewhere in New England don't have strong local coverage.
Mm-hmm. Kathleen?
What don't we cover that I wish we covered or that we
Yeah.
don't?
When you go to Steve Groves and say, I want 50
What do I
more-
want?
Yeah.
Oh, I want more investigative reporters. I mean, the number one thing, if we're talking about listening to audience and looking at metrics, what people want from us and respond to is exclusive reporting, is stories that they can't and aren't getting anywhere else. And so we're in the process of building out that team and building those muscles across the whole newsroom, so it's not just a single team, but that everybody knows how to do some amount of sort of diggier, more investigative work. So that would be one. We could write way more about the suburbs than we do. People in those communities do not have regular coverage, and they're often governments with lots of money and people who are not leaders that are not used to scrutiny and could use it. I could go on. I have a list. You told me when I took this job, keep a list in your back pocket of everything you want. And I've got it.
Again, you don't always get them, but it's good to have it.
Yeah.
Lauren, do you buy that? No, fewer reporters for scoops and investigative reporting?
Yeah, I just want to affirm what Nancy said. You know, we've had an opportunity to expand and move geographically into some areas. And for like the first year, it's just fish in a barrel, you know. It's like you show up at council and you're like, oh my gosh, you know. And there's like a reform that can kind of happen in real time, right? And if we've done that in just a couple of places, then my assumption would be that, you know, other opportunities exist. Yes, we just don't have the people to get to all of those places.
So I'm going to ask an odd off-topic question that came to mind as I listened to you all. Everybody should read the columns of Gene Patterson from when he was the executive editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. That was an era when newspapers were rich. But he did something that I wonder that would be a lot harder to do. He essentially told his readers that they were assholes. He did. The classic Gene Patterson column was after the bombings in Birmingham, the bombing in Birmingham, where he essentially wrote a front page column that said, "This is your fault. This is your fault for building the South that led to this." Journalists now have to think a lot harder about their readers, courting their readers, what they want, and that's a good thing, that's right. Do you think, or can you think of examples where you've pissed off your readers? Or do you think that that's something that's a lot harder to do today?
Every day we make them mad.
Good, say it.
I don't know if this story will land or if I should tell it, but
You should definitely tell
Then
us.
definitely.
This is off the record, right? Good.
we have a printed paper, and I thought it would be a good idea to deliver it to some halls of influence. And so we started, we asked for permission. We deliver it now to the headquarters of the LDS Church for free every week, so they get it. And we had permission to bring it to the legislature. And then I got a call from my CERC manager who was like, "We're not allowed at the legislature." And I was like, "Why aren't we allowed at the legislature?" And he said, "Well, here's the email string. Maybe you can figure it out." And so I go look at the board of the people who decides what enters the legislature and what doesn't, and there's the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate. We have done them zero favors over the course of the last few years in our reporting. And so my assumption was, that we had pissed them off and that they weren't going to let our papers in. So I called the Lieutenant Governor, who is in charge of this board of people, and I said, "Hey, you're not letting our paper in." And she said, "Well, I believe in free speech, I believe in you, and also would you bring the Deseret News with you?"
That's funny.
Which was great, I thought, right?
Yeah.
2 papers,
Yeah.
they should both be there, right? And so I do think, it is our job to make folks mad
Right.
on some occasions, and that is perfectly fine, and it is up to us to figure out how to navigate those conversations effectively with openness and respectfulness, such that we get to a better place.
Are you all finding, by the way, I find it when I talk to reporters, much more hostility from public officials, even from a lot of readers. In the era of Trump, it's become okay to are you all finding that? Maybe start with Kathleen.
Absolutely. I mean, we find it hard to get some, frankly, that it's hard sometimes to get Republicans to even call us back on some. We've made a concerted effort. I have made a concerted effort. Was a political editor in my background. That's everything I've ever done, to just really insist that we constantly call them up and knock on their doors and ask for comment, and just as a habit that we can't break, even though we know that often they don't pick up their phones. So there is definitely sort of more formal, organized hostility towards us in some corners, and we're working on it. Like we feel, I don't think we can report about our state without regularly knocking on those doors and asking questions and representing those views in our pages. And that does sometimes anger some of our readers, but that's the job.
Nancy?
Look, we piss off, pardon me, we tick off readers all the time, particularly in a highly politicized environment. Republicans think we're too tough on Trump. The Democrats think we're not tough enough. Every day somebody's mad about something. They're mad about our sports coverage. I actually I don't worry so much about the readers. I also know that, I'm thinking about, I ticked off the people at Harvard, and they texted me they were angry at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I ticked off the mayor, and she called me and yelled at me, and I ticked off the state legislature because he wrote about how they operate in the dark. I'm actually much happier to be ticking off the leaders in power, and I don't worry quite so much about the readers because they're still staying with us.
So we have
Yay.
1 more minute. Talk, everybody give me 5 seconds of how do you change a legacy newsroom? I mean, how do you convince? You got 5 seconds.
5 seconds?
No, just give me, or one person. Like, I mean, the other newsrooms, many of the other newsrooms represented here, they're not legacy, which means they started changed. So talk about changing a legacy newsroom for 27
All right, you just took 20 seconds. All I'll say is
sorry.
that we turn over every rock. Turn over every rock. Do not look in any corner of your organization, because there's always something that can be improved.
Oh, yeah, I agree with that, but it's still hard. When I said everybody had to own audience and understand their numbers and data, some people went like this to me. A well-known, respected journalist at the Boston Globe said, please protect me from the data.
I think sadly, sadly.
And
He was at the Globe, and he's no longer at the Globe?
No, that person's still there, because it's a valued
Thank you all.
person.
I think they're going to kick us off, so thank you.
Thank you.